So we are recording as I speak. And the recordings will be available on the Northwest Lower Michigan Synod YouTube channel. Okay, so if you click on the channel, all these different presentations will come up. So if there's someone that you talk to, or they express an interest in actually taking part in this seminar, they can look at that. They can join next week. Each session is not totally dependent upon the previous session. Okay, my main goal with all of this, and I think as a Synod staff, is to see how we can move forward in terms of racial justice in our Synod. So again, I see that all of you have already done this, but to mute your microphone during the presentation. That sort of keeps the barking dogs away and all of that kind of thing. So that's helpful, and we don't tend to have as much feedback. I'm intending that we spend about an hour together today, and I invite you, if you'd like, to use the chat at the bottom. If there's things that you want to ask, I may not be looking at that very directly as I'm giving the presentation, but we'll have those to look at it later on. And I'm going to hopefully allow for some discussion at the end. Okay. So, write down your questions or put them on the chat, or just write down your thoughts. And so as we begin, I want to begin with a word of prayer. And so we pray, good and gracious God, we gather once again in this electronic way in the midst of this pandemic. Each day, we're not sure what the day will bring. We live in the midst of questioning and fear and wonder and not knowing what the future will bring, but we know that you are with us in the midst of any change, anything that we have. And so we thank you for gathering us today. And we particularly praise you for the wonders of creation and for creating us, your children, all your children, in your image and your likeness. And so as we are together this afternoon, open our hearts to a greater understanding of the interconnectedness of all your people, regardless of our racial origin, our cultural backgrounds. We are your children. And so may we find new awareness each and every day, and particularly this afternoon, of who we are as your children. May we find strength to continue the journey, to the place where we truly are one in you, where we are truly one in your love and your grace and your mercy. And we ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. So maybe one of the things that you have thought in your mind is the question, why am I calling this time together learning with the bishop? Or why do we, call a time like this that? Well, I'm grateful that Bishop Satterley periodically invites time for education and for discussion on topics where all of us can learn from one another. And I really believe that growing in our personal awareness of the racism and the bigotry that is part of our everyday lives, that this is essential to grow in our endeavor to be people of racial justice. There's a long, long history, and we know that, of racism in our world. We'll actually take a look at a historical timeline this afternoon as we talk about this. It's a history that continues. It continues each and every day, so I'm grateful that all of us can spend this time together as individuals, because that's where we live, and as church, because we are gathered as church, and we are church together, to continue this struggle that has been there over centuries, over the lifetime of the world, really, to dismantle racism in all its forms. And so I'm hoping that these times together will give us new insights, new strategies, new ways of confronting the systemic racism that we find in our world. We've had different iterations of anti-racism committees in our synod, and we want to go into the future seeing how we can, again, find new ways of dealing with racism. So I thank Bishop Satterlee for gathering us together to learn and to grow and to be renewed in our efforts to be people of racial justice. So I call this series of discussions, which I wish we could have a little bit more interaction. Why do we call it a primer? Racism has been around forever, okay? Well, we probably remember that by definition, a primer is a first textbook for the teaching of reading. How many of us remember Dick and Jane? Okay, I'm not seeing too many waves, but I sure do. Okay, Dick and Jane. I'm old. The term by extension, though, is also used to describe the basic elements of any subject. And I've come to realize, unfortunately, over and over again, that we need to come back to the basics of anti-racism or racial justice over and over again. You know, I remember the summer of 1967. It seems like yesterday, but it's over 50 years ago. And I was coming home from months as an exchange student in Sweden. You know, news wasn't 24/7 back then. And the news that had reached us across the pond, I really thought that there was not going to be a metro airport, that there wasn't going to be any Detroit left to come home to because of the race riots that were in Southwest Detroit. That's a long time ago. But it's not that long in terms of the whole issues of racial justice and anti-racism. And I also remember, as we attempted to do anti-racism seminars in the years after 1967 and into the 80s, 70s, and 80s, that the resounding response from so many white people when they were confronted with racism, the response was, "But I'm not racist. I'm not racist." That was the resounding reply. My fear is that that particular response came out of the fact that oftentimes we began those seminars by saying to people, "You are racist." Well, you know, when we start a conversation like that, people put up their defenses right away. But then my hope is that we can continue learning ways of walking together and confronting the sin of racism. And my hope is that we might at least have some intellectual knowledge or more intellectual knowledge today that we really live in a system of racism, and we have grown up and been raised in a system of racism. You know, I thought we'd made progress. And then the present climate of hate began to blatantly show itself again over and over. And it really seemed and seems like people once again had and have been given permission to blatantly act in ways of showing white supremacy and racism and white advantage on all fronts of our world and of our country. I remember often a discussion that we had at one of the publicly engaged church table meetings about a year ago. You know, and in my own white outrage, I asked Ken, Ken Pons, the chair of the table. He happens to be with us in this seminar today. And I asked him this question. And I said, Ken, how can you be so calm about all of this? And I said it in that frame of voice. How can you be so calm in the midst of all of this? And God bless Ken, in his own inimitable way, his response to me was this, in this tone, because nothing has changed. I get really emotional with that. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed ultimately. We try, but we have to continue trying, and we have to continue doing what we can. And so those words of Ken, they ring in my ears often, as each and every day almost, and especially as we hear the tragic story of Ahmaud Arbery, shot to death while out for a run in our day and age. And that's why I think we need to call this a primer of racial justice. Even as we think about it as a primer, I think we also, and I'm going to cover that more in the weeks to come, is to think about, all the pain, all the suffering, but then how we can get so exhausted as we try to think about racial justice and have that as a part of our being when racism keeps raising its ugly head in so many ways. So, a primer about racial justice. Now, much of what I'm sharing with us today comes from a seminar that I took earlier this year, and it was entitled Doing Our Own Work, an anti-racism seminar for white people. And I think one of the things that really attracted me about that particular seminar was that second half of the title, an anti-racism seminar for white people. We live in different worlds. All of us live in different worlds, no matter where we came from. And we have such backgrounds that we're so different. And, I don't live in any race other than white. And as we look at it, that's a vast majority of the people that we have that are part of the Northwest Lower Michigan Synod. And so it rang pretty clear to me that I really want to be part of this seminar, because it's how can I be part of Allies for Change? And that brings up the group that sponsored us. Many sponsored the seminar. Many of you may have heard of it. It's a group called Allies for Change. And it comes out of Lansing, out of East Lansing. And Allies for Change was founded by Melanie Morrison. She's been doing work for justice in the church for many, many, many years. When I served in the Southeast Michigan Synod of the ELCA, I was part of a group that she led called Sister Colleagues. And she had a retreat and conference center in Lyons, Michigan, not too far out of Lansing, that was called Levin. And one of the programs that she had out of there was called Sister Colleagues. And it had to do with all the isms in our world. Allies for Change has grown into a group of many wonderful people. And what it really is, it's a network of anti-oppression educators who share a passion for social justice and a commitment to creating and sustaining life-giving ally relationships and communities. How can we together be part of a group that really works for justice, racial justice, any kind of oppression? And we're particularly looking at racial justice. And so what they work at is resisting a hierarchy of oppressions and working as allies across difference. And they seek to create new patterns of relating and transforming unjust structures. It was a great workshop. And so as we think about and as I talk about anti-racism and racial justice and how that can be part of our lives and how we're called to live that out, much of what I'm saying comes out of that workshop. But I'd like you to start thinking about your sphere of influence. Your sphere of influence. I think what can happen with us is a lot of times we'll initially think, oh, I don't really have a sphere of influence. How do I influence people? You know, as pastors, of course, we do. And we really have influence in every realm of life. Oftentimes we think, you know, what difference does it really make? You know, do I really have influence? So as we talk about racial justice and as we move into today and in these next weeks, think about your own situation. You know, the people with whom you interact. You know, who are you? You know, how do you behave? And how do you speak? And as you begin to think about who you are and how you speak and who you're with, those are all influences. They're influences not only of yourself, but all aspects of your life and the people with whom you relate. What we say and what we do and how we act makes a difference. And I think sometimes we forget that. But particularly those of us who are involved in the church or involved in any way in society, we have to remember what we say and what we do and how we act makes a difference. So there's really 4 realms of racism, particularly that we dealt with in the seminar. 4 different levels and realms. First of all, there's the personal realm. How do we experience racism in ourselves, in our own lives? How do we really realize that we're part of a system? You know, a system of racial inequality, of power, you know, a system of where we really have the power to do and to have things that not everyone does. You know, we are part of a system of really having so much. And then in our personal relationships, and how do we move into interpersonal relationships? That realm of racism, the interpersonal realm of racism. And then we move into the institutional realm of racism. And that is all overshadowed by our cultural aspects of racism. And so as we think about and talk about racism and racial justice in these days, I want to invite you to keep in mind how much our own personal beliefs that we have developed, that we've been taught, our attitudes and our values influence the ways in which we behave and how we act and the language that we use with the people with whom we interact. And that makes a difference. And so it's out of our personal and interpersonal relationships that we develop institutional policies, rules, procedures, practices, laws that are part of a system of privilege. And then the personal and interpersonal relationships that are lived out in our institutions because we all live within institutions, becomes the dominant cultural norm as we seek to define the values of our life. How do we define beauty and truth? How do we do that out of systems that can be systems of oppression and dominance? And so systemic racism and white privilege has become such a norm in our world that I'm not sure that we even realize it most of the time. And so I think part of the first step of working towards racial justice and being part of a community that tries to live racial justice is to begin to really think about the systemic racism and white privilege that we live in and the white privilege that we've come out of. And so how can that then influence how we can become more than that? And it's only in our realization that that's how we live that we then can begin to make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of others. Okay, so what I want to do now is to help us get in touch a bit more with systemic racism. We're going to go on a journey. It's a journey that can be very startling, I think. It's a journey of historical moments in racism in these our United States. And I'm focusing on the United States. We could go back a lot further, but just to get a flavor of where we've come from as citizens of the United States. And my thanks go out to Allies for Change and the People's Dialogue Project for compiling this historical timeline. Abbreviating it somewhat because we'd be here for a long, long, long time if we went through everything. So the timeline begins in 1492. You've heard that little poem, I'm sure. Christopher Columbus arrives in America, and Columbus set in motion a pattern of colonization involving the destruction of tribal cultures, the death of indigenous people, and that continued through the next 200 years and beyond. 1493, between the 15th and 18th centuries, European nations engaged in extensive overseas exploration. We all know that from history. But in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull that was known as the Doctrine of Discovery, if we use English. And the bull claimed that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, suggesting that non-Christians did not hold the same rights to land as Christians. The words and ideas expressed in the bull were important to establishing a belief that European nations were superior to native nations. 1503, Queen Isabella of Spain, we remember her from our grade school history, establishes labor policy for forcing Native Americans to both work the land for settlers and convert to Christianity. 1619. In August of that year, a ship arrived at Point Comfort in the British colony of Virginia. It was bearing a cargo of 20, and I say cargo, it's a horrible word, of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. And their arrival inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for the next 250 years. 250 years. which actually is a drop in the bucket if we go back even farther in terms of racism. 1639, enslaved Africans were prohibited from carrying firearms by a Virginia law. There was one exception. When permission was granted, again by the white people, then they could bear firearms to defend against Indian raids, Native Americans. Again, racism in many forms. 1662, Virginia enacts a law of hereditary slavery, meaning that children born to an enslaved mother inherit her enslaved status. The law was intended to enslave the increasing number of children born as a result of rape by white men. 1664, Maryland enacts the first law to prevent intermarriage of English women to Black men. Then throughout the 1700s and the 1800s, Southern states passed laws making it illegal for enslaved people to learn to read or write, and making it a crime for those who tried to learn to read or write, making it a crime for anyone who tried to teach them. It would be a crime for them. 1763. Items taken from a smallpox infirmary are distributed among Native Americans as gifts during a peace parley with Pontiac's Confederacy. From those gifts, about 100,000 Native Americans die of smallpox in the ensuing epidemic. That says even more today as we sit in the midst of our pandemic. 1776, we've celebrated that as white people for many years. The Declaration of Independence is adopted in the United States. A part of it that had been in that Declaration of Independence to begin with is deleted. It's a section denouncing the chattel slavery trade. 1787. During the Constitutional Convention, Southern delegates threatened to pull out on several occasions when it appears that the institution of chattel slavery might be threatened. And that's where the 3/5 compromise comes in. That's when it is adopted. Enslaved Africans are to be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of strengthening Southern representation in Congress and the Electoral College. Of the first 12 United States presidents, all except John Adams and John Quincy Adams owned enslaved people as property. 1793, first fugitive slave law is enacted by the United States Congress. The measure makes it a criminal offense to harbor fugitives or prevent their arrest. 1803, the United States buys from France a large portion of land west of the Mississippi River. President Thomas Jefferson proposes that many of the Native American nations living east of the Mississippi River, think of where that is, be removed west of the river to lands where they would be out of the way of US settlers. And so in 1830, Congress votes in favor of the Indian Removal Act. And this becomes an integral element of national Native American policy. During the 1830s and the 1840s, the US Army forces thousands of Native American families to leave their belongings and to move to lands west of the Mississippi River, to leave their belongings and to move. west. The US forces the Cherokee onto the Trail of Tears, which directly results in the death of 4,000 to 8,000 people. They didn't even keep track of the numbers. 1853 to 1856, many Native American nations are induced to sell most of their remaining land and accept small parcels of land commonly called reservations. In this period, more than 52 treaties are made with Native American groups, and the United States acquires 174 million acres of Native American land. 174 million acres. Driven to poverty, Native Americans are forced to trade land for goods. 1854, the arrival of 13,000 Chinese marks the beginning of large-scale immigration from China. Chinese workers are primarily employed in building the transcontinental railroad. 1854, in the People versus Hall, the California Supreme Court reverses the conviction of a white man in a murder trial, ruling that the testimony of key Chinese witnesses is inadmissible because no Black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. 1865 to 1867. The post-Civil War era of Reconstruction in the United States establishes passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery but retains the right of servitude as punishment for the conviction of a crime. During this time, Black codes, laws to restrict Blacks' freedom, and Jim Crow laws that enforced public racial segregation were enacted. 1880, boarding schools for Native American children are established in the United States as an instrument for acculturating Indian children to so-called American ways of living and thinking. Children are taken from their homes and communities and placed in schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language or practice their indigenous culture and spiritual traditions. One of those is not so far from us in Harbor Springs, and that was in existence way into the 60s, the 1960s. 1890, Homer Plessy, a free Black man, brought suit against the state of Louisiana for denying him the right to ride in the whites-only train car. In 1896, it took that long for the lawsuit, the court ruled against Plessy, arguing that segregation was not inherently unequal. This decision paved the legality of racially segregated schools across the United States. 1913, California passes the first alien land law, prohibiting groups ineligible to become citizens from owning or leasing land. The law particularly discriminates against Asians. 1915, D.W. Griffith's controversial film, The Birth of a Nation, chronicles the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, depicting illiterate, uncouth, and lecherous for white women, Black men, who had supposedly taken the reins of power in Southern states during Reconstruction. The film, which at the time was a huge commercial success, was influential in contributing to caricatures of Black people. The NAACP spearheaded an unsuccessful campaign to ban the film. 1915, the Ku Klux Klan receives charter from Fulton County, Georgia. By 1924, the organization is strong in Oklahoma, Indiana, California, Oregon, and Ohio. Excuse me. 1917. In recruiting soldiers for World War I, the United States Army begins using IQ tests, which relied heavily upon European American cultural knowledge and English language literacy. Black Americans and non-English speaking immigrants on average scored much lower than whites on the test. And at the end of World War I, the test remained in use in a variety of situations outside of the military. For example, IQ tests were used to screen new immigrants as they entered the United States at Ellis Island, the slanted IQ tests. 1924. The Johnson-Reed Act overhauls U.S. immigration and creates the first quota system based upon national origin. The act favors immigrants from Northern and Western Europe over the quote-unquote inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. This explicit preference system continues to shape American demographics and immigration policy until the 1960s. 1932 to 1972. At the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, 400 Black men who had syphilis were purposely not treated for the disease and allowed to sicken and die so that doctors from the United States Public Health Service could study the disease. The men were never told they had syphilis, and they were denied treatment even after penicillin was known to be a cure. The late 1920s to 1936. Anti-Mexican sentiment spiked during the Great Depression as whites accused Mexicans of stealing American jobs, and Mexican Americans were discouraged and even forbidden from accepting charitable aid. 1930s. In order to spur construction and create jobs during the Depression, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, is created. The FHA underwrites private housing loans, making it possible for the first time to buy a home with only 10% down payment. The FHA's underwriting manual explicitly encourages developers to include whites only in their deeds. FHA loans were not allowed in the city of Detroit. (1935) Congress passes the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act. The Social Security Act exempts agricultural and domestic workers, who were predominantly African American, Mexican, and Asian, from receiving what was called then old age insurance. The Wagner Act, guaranteeing workers' rights, does not prohibit unions from racial discrimination. The result is that people of color are locked out of higher paying jobs and union benefits such as medical care and job security and pensions. The 1940s. With as many as 80% of Latinx children attending segregated schools, school officials claimed that Latinx students were dirty and infected with diseases that put white students at risk. California officials argued that Mexican American students didn't speak English and were thus not entitled to attend English-speaking schools. 1944. The U.S. Supreme Court upholds the relocation and detention of all people of Japanese ancestry in war relocation centers, regardless of loyalty to the United States or United States citizenship. 1950s. The United States begins Operation Wetback, deporting over 3.8 million persons of Mexican descent over the next 5 years. 1951, a young mother of 5, Henrietta Lacks, visited the Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. Her cancer cells, codenamed Gila, Henrietta Lacks, Gila, were taken without her knowledge and became one of the most important tools in medicine. That is, Gila cells were instrumental in developing the polio vaccine. And so those blood cells, they were damaging consequences for her family because so many of them struggled to get access to the healthcare advantages that their mother's cells helped make possible. And so, like the Tuskegee Institute and Gila, there are numerous examples of historic research studies conducted on individuals of color without their knowledge or consent. 1955, Emmett Till, aged 14, on summer vacation from Chicago, is kidnapped, brutally beaten, and drowned in Money, Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. The men who kidnapped him were tried for murder, but an all-white male jury acquitted them. In 2017, remember that happened in 1955. In 2017, the wife of one of the accused men, Carolyn Bryant, who had testified against Emmett, admitted that she lied about the encounter for more than 70 years. Lynching was a systematic form of violence used to terrorize communities of color and maintain white supremacy for all that time. 1960. Despite the passage of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870, and the 19th Amendment in 1920 that prohibited government agencies from denying US citizens the right to vote on the basis of race or sex, state and local municipalities throughout the South used poll taxes, literary tests, economic reprisals, and other forms of harassment to keep Black men and women from registering and voting for more than 90 years. In 1960, 5 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in Congress, only 5% of eligible African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. 1963. On Sunday morning, September 15th, 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan planted a box of dynamite with a time delay under the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church, an African American church in Birmingham, Alabama. At 10:22 a.m., 26 children were walking into the basement assembly room when the bomb exploded. 4 girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were killed in the attack, and 22 additional people were injured. 1963, a witness identified Robert Chambliss as the man who placed the bomb under the steps of the church. He was arrested and charged with murder and possessing a box of 122 sticks of dynamite without a permit. On October 8th, 1963, about 5 weeks Chambliss was found not guilty of murder and received a $100 fine and a 6-month jail sentence for having the dynamite. 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American draftsman who had lived all his life in the United States, is clubbed to death in a Detroit bar by 2 white, unemployed auto workers who believed that he was Japanese. 1992. With the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and increased immigration from Central America, some states and local municipalities created legislation to discourage Mexican immigrants from settling in their communities. Many localities actively practice discrimination against recent immigrants, especially those from Central America, by establishing ordinances that restricted day laborers from congregating and finding adequate housing, thereby limiting their economic opportunities. 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, the so-called Crime Bill, is enacted. The bill provides for 100,000 new police officers, additional funding for the creation and maintenance of prisons, and 60 new death penalty offenses, including certain drug offenses not related to homicide. Known as a direct descendant of lynching, the death penalties disproportionately targets and terrorizes Black and Latinx communities. 2001. In the wake of 9/11, hundreds of hate crimes were directed at Arab Americans, Muslims, and Sikhs throughout the country. Crimes ranging from vandalism to verbal assaults to the murder of a Sikh restaurant owner in Arizona mistaken for an Arab. 2005. Despite repeated warnings from federal disaster officials that Hurricane Katrina could breach levees in New Orleans, the United States government was fatally slow in responding to the disaster, leaving thousands of people of color stranded for many days without adequate food, shelter, or medical attention. 2006. Michigan voters passed Proposal 2, banning affirmative action programs based on race, gender, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment and education. Since that time, studies have shown that affirmative action bans have led to significant declines of students of color in undergraduate and graduate programs in Michigan universities. For example, studies have found that bans have reduced the number of graduate students of color by 12%. 2011. Although African Americans account for only 12% of the population, 44% of all prisoners in the United States are African American, and the average prison term of African Americans is 69% longer than the term for whites convicted of the same offense. 2011 again. According to a Pew Research Center analysis of newly available government data, the median wealth of white households is 20 times that of Black households and 18 times that of Hispanic households. These lopsided wealth ratios are the largest since the government began publishing such data a quarter century ago. Again, 2011, New York Police Department stop and frisk data revealed that in 2011, a record 684,330 people were stopped. 87% of those people who were stopped were Black and Latinx individuals. Although Blacks and Latinx individuals only comprise, approximately 25% and 28% of New York City's total population. 90% of those stopped were completely innocent of any criminal activity. 2013. As of 2013, almost 1,000 high schools, universities, and professional sports teams still had Native American mascots, 35 of which are in the state of Michigan. When complaint was brought to the United States Department of Education from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights about that continual usage of Indian mascots, it was dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence of racial discrimination. 2014. On July 14th, Eric Garner died in Staten Island, New York, after a police officer put him in a chokehold and ignored his repeated cries, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." The entire incident was caught on film. The New York City Police Department policy prohibits the use of chokeholds, and the New York City Medical Examiner's Office concluded that Garner died partly as a result of the chokehold. After having the case for 2 months, a grand jury decided not to indict Officer Pantaleo. Pantaleo was fired by the New York Police Department in August of 2019, 5 years later. 2014, the water source for the city of Flint, where over half the residents are Black, was changed from Lake Huron and the Detroit River to a less costly source, the Flint River. And we all know that due to insufficient water treatment, lead leaked from the water pipes into the drinking water and exposed over 100,000 residents to elevated lead levels. It goes on today. The water change is also the cause of a Legionnaire's disease outbreak that has killed many people, and it killed 12 people and affected 87 others. And we know that although the citizens of Flint were not able to use their water, that the city continued to require them to pay their water bills for a long time. And the water still is not safe. 2016. Based on data compiled by the Washington Post and The Guardian, Black males between the ages of 15 and 34 are 9 times more likely to be killed by police than any other demographic. In 2016, 34% of all people killed by police were Black males, even though they make up only 6% of the US population. And in January of 2017, an executive order banned foreign nationals from several Middle Eastern and African countries where residents are predominantly Muslim, and from North Korea and Venezuela from visiting or entering the United States, including those seeking refugee status. In June of 2017, in a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court upheld what has become known as the Muslim ban. As a result, nationals from Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, and Venezuela are prevented from coming to the United States, even if they have family members who are US citizens. Again, on August 12th of 2017, a Unite the Right, R-I-G-H-T, Unite the Right rally, organized by self-proclaimed white supremacists, was held in Charlottesville. The demonstrators clashed with counter-demonstrators. In the afternoon, a speeding car rammed into anti-racist demonstrators, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring at least 19 others. That same day, armed white supremacist demonstrators marched around the congregation Beth Israel, a Jewish synagogue in Charlottesville, screaming "Sig Heil" and threatening to burn the synagogue to the ground. No one was injured, but members of the congregation were held hostage for hours, fearing to leave before demonstrators dispersed. And then 2018, since early May of that year, many children, the number I have is 2,342, have been separated from their parents after crossing the southern US border, according to the Department of Homeland Security, as part of a zero-tolerance immigration status. And the list goes on. There are many other situations that we know of. Some of these that we talked about today are lesser known. They're only samples. And so with that in mind, if we have any sense that there's racial justice or racial equality in our society today, we know that that really is not the case. And so that's an arduous list. It points out why we need to be people of racial justice. And so we've looked at the history of it. I'm going to open it up now. And if there are any comments, any questions, let me look at the chat here. Okay. This is from Bishop Satterley. He said, "I need to go to another Zoom meeting. Thank you for being here. This is wonderful and terrible." So, okay. You can unmute yourself as you would like to. Let me just look here. No, that's not from me. It was a text. I thought maybe somebody sent me a text. So, difficult, horrible things. Miriam, you gotta unmute yourself. Let's see, I can unmute you too here.
Sure.
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Good.
I just said, the first thing I'd say is I feel physically sick.
I know.
I really do. And I have so many things that I'd love to discuss with you all of you here, but I'll just bring out this. The other day I was listening to CNN, and Cornell Brooks, who is the former CEO of the NAACP, stated that he believes race relations are getting worse. And he was talking about this in response to Ahmed's, which his dad called, and which word I'm using, lynching, because that's what it was. If you look it up look it up what it means, it was a lynching. And he said that that lynching was really a metaphor. That Cornell Brooks said the lynching was a metaphor for our country as to race relations now. Mm-hmm. I thought that was pretty telling.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah. Okay, we had somebody else that had to leave, and they said, "See you next week." Oops.
You all, I would imagine, have heard some of these statistics too, but I just looked online, and in Michigan, African Americans make up 14% of the population and 40% of COVID deaths.
Mhm.
And this was from the Med page today. And Dr. Phyllis Jones from the American Public Health Association said, there's nothing different about race. It's about the conditions of our lives.
Yes. Yeah. I think that going through that timeline, just it does make us sick. And it's, for me, it sets that stage that, oh my gosh, as Ken said, nothing has changed. And I think it's important that we set that stage so that we can then take a look at where are we today. And I think that's what you're lifting up, Miriam, is, you know, the timeline that I used certainly does not even begin to cover everything. You know, there's so many things about racial discrimination and hatred and all that we know of much more commonly. Some of these things were not as common. I mean, it's important to go back and really go back in history for all those hundreds of years. But, you know, I think of all the things that were not on that timeline, you know, Rosa Parks, you know, just innumerable, you know, Martin Luther King assassination, all those things that we know of in our kind of our history. But then all these others, you know. And so the sobering question for us is, okay, as a primer, that was the yesterday, I'd invite us to really do some prayerful reflection this week. And then we look at our situation next week in terms of where we are now. Okay. And then the third week is, you know, how can we begin to move ahead? What does that mean? Yeah.
You know, and one thing I was thinking, as I see all of you here, I'm so glad we're all here together, but it makes me feel sad that there's only this few of us here for this topic in our whole synod.
I think a response to that is, I am so grateful that we are here. You know, I'm gonna get really emotional. You know, it is, you know, it's somehow we have been led to be part of this. Okay, and one of the things that we're going to talk about is the sustainability of sticking with this. You know, many of you probably have been part of this for a long time. This has been part of Ken's life forever. And you know, it's like, how do we keep on keeping on? And the change or the influence that we can have is, we just have to keep at it, you know, and to say we are going to keep at it, you know. Ryan, do you want to speak that, or do you want me to read it? You can take your
I'll unmute myself, and then let's see if I can pull it back up, because I was trying to think about how I wanted to phrase that.
I can read it if you want me to. You know,
I can read it. People can hear my voice if you haven't heard it in a while.
That would be good for them to hear you.
Anyway. So my question is this, because I think about what the bishop has talked about a lot in preaching, and that is to constantly keep Jesus as the focus. And as I'm reading other literature right now about how we become an increasingly secular age, and to try and not make racial justice a humanistic thing, or even a devoid of God and just make it a moralistic thing and keep it focused on like who God is. How do we as pastors, of those of us who are pastors or even lay leaders that get the opportunity to preach and teach, how do we do racial justice from the pulpit, if you will, or from our classes while keeping Jesus the focus? And so I was able to listen to Reverend Jim Wallace's book, Christ in Crisis. And I know that in one section, he raises Genesis 1 as a framework for all of humanity being created in the image of God. Also then relates that to John 1, where the word Jesus is part of creation too. So then an attack on a human being of any kind is an attack on the face of God, which is an attack on Christ himself. And so that's one way in which Jesus becomes a part of this conversation. But I'm wondering if there's other approaches to this, maybe in more of a unifying, positive way, a resurrected way versus a crucifixion way, if you will, if that makes any sense.
CJ, I know that this is one of the topics that you speak on often when you speak on it, but you preach on it often as you're in various settings with Living Waters Ministry. And I saw you reach for your unmute.
I did.
So go ahead.
I think it's a really good question. There's a couple answers to that for me. I've sat in on a lot of meetings where we're trying to develop strategies and initiatives for multiculturalism, for anti-racism work. And recently I was at Churchwide for one of these meetings, and I sort of had the realization that the issue may perhaps be that people don't have a real strong relationship with Jesus. And if we were to boil it all the way back to a very basic starting point, I think that is a fair place to start. Like, do our people love Jesus in a way that they embody in their daily living? That is a root question for me. Now, I do think that, also to get to your question, I think there's a focus on transformation. I was in a meeting on Saturday with our Bridge Builder team, and a lot of allies being accomplices. Hopefully,
can you say that over again, because you froze them
sometimes. And so, what does it mean to be an accomplice? And embrace also a life. Yep, is my internet screwing up?
It's okay now.
You're good now.
Okay. All right. So I don't know what you caught.
Whoop, he froze up again. Until he comes back, until it starts up again for CJ. One of the things that just blew me away when I was at this seminar is we did some small group work, okay, and we had another pastor from our synod who was part of it, and then there was a person who's in his 60s, but he was a PK. His father his father and his brother were Lutheran pastors. And in the one small group, the one pastor came to me and he said, I've blown away. In his small group, he had a couple people that were in their 20s. And they were like, they couldn't believe that there were any pastors at this seminar who would even have any interest in doing anything about racial justice. And it just kind of blew me away. It just, their perception of the church is that we don't talk about racial justice. Are you back, CJ? He's not. Okay.
I really feel the need to share my story.
Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Oh, sorry.
He's coming back.
My internet's messing.
Okay. We're going to have Dan go ahead, and would you share your story, and then we'll get back to CJ, and then I have a comment for Nan Denke too.
The presentation you made today, I heard for the first time, or something very similar to it, 15 or 20 years ago, at a racism seminar put on by our anti-racism team.
Mhm.
And it was the first time that I, as a privileged white person, had any concept or idea of systemic racism or white privilege. I truly believed up until that time that if I, as an individual, were accepting of all people, of all cultures and races, that I was not in any way, shape, or form a racist,
Mhm.
and did not even realize the disease that is in our whole society. It was an eye-opening experience for me.
Mhm.
But I have a guess that perhaps in the Sunrise and Travis and the northern part of the Bay Conference, there are many, many devout Lutheran white people of privilege who have never heard a presentation like the one you just gave,
Mhm.
and who feel today the way I felt 15 or 20 years ago. They see all talk of racism simply whether if you're personally prejudiced or not,
Mhm.
and don't understand the concept of white privilege
Mhm.
or systemic racism.
Mhm.
And so somehow I think, and I don't know that giving a lecture like you gave today is something we could do from the pulpit, but I think we need to find the way to educate our people who have always lived. I grew up in a Pennsylvania town of 6,000, and I've lived in small towns my entire life. I have not had to rub shoulders with people of other cultures,
Mhm.
and really have not personally seen a lot of the discrimination simply because there aren't people around me who could be discriminated against. And so I really think the message you shared today is what we need to get out to a much larger audience.
Mhm. Mhm. I appreciate that.
Roseanne,
Yes, who is that? I'm trying to see.
this is Bev.
Yes.
Um, I had to get back in bed, so I just
Okay.
wanted to say that your presentation was excellent, but along with the history of racism, I think we need to understand the history of resistance to racism as well,
Mhm.
because if we're going to look at what we can do for the future, we need to understand the past
Yep.
on resistance and efforts to reform.
That's really good as you share that, Bev. And I just the definition of resistance, okay, is it you know, people resisting, it's like, okay, what do we resist and what is it that we fight against resistance? I mean, just the word is a whole definition that we need to deal with in terms of racial justice and all that. Dan, what comes to my mind is you're talking, it's like we're in such different spots. And, you know, Doug, you and I have talked, and we've talked, you know, did Ken leave? I'm trying to see. I think he might have
I
left.
think he left.
Okay, darn, I was going to speak to him. But I will bring that up. It's like, okay, what is our goal here? What are we trying to do? You know, there's been different iterations of the anti-racism team and committee and all that in the Synod. What you bring up, Dan, to the whole issue of we're white, a majority of white people, and a lot of people have not had the gift to have their consciousness raised. Okay, so how will we go forward from here? You know, I mean, that's a big issue that we've talked about. You know, Nan wrote on the chat, she said, I am missing the presence and the voices of our brothers and sisters who are people of color. Absolutely. You know, and that's why I was like, Ken, you left. And you know, that in one sense, it's like, oh my God, then he becomes a token. You know what I'm saying? You know, it's that whole issue. But yes, you're right, Nan. And you know, I'm new in this synod in the sense that I spent 20 years in Southeast Michigan. Okay, Southeast Michigan Synod. I was born and raised in this area. Then I've been back up north here for, what is it, like 6 years now, I guess? Yeah, 7. And we're a whole different synod than Southeast just because of the fact that we are so white. You know, I mean, our whole population is, you know. So,
Roseanne?
yes, Doug, please.
May I jump in just to
Yes,
just
please.
there? Thank you.
Yep.
There are multiple ways to go at this conversation, and they're kind of mutually exclusive of one another.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is for white people to talk amongst themselves, because I'm willing to bet that even with social distancing and quarantining, everybody has encountered some incident of racism within the last 2 days.
Yep.
You've heard it. I would say that the church deserves the name "We Don't Talk About Race," because I'm hard pressed right now to come up with an example where I have heard the church talk about racism. And in order to prime the pump in a slightly more radical direction, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to say it this way. One of the ways that you know you're white is if you listen to the texts last Sunday of the stoning of Stephen and you didn't think of Ahmaud Arbery.
Mm-hmm.
If you heard the story of the stoning of Stephen, the crowd that picked up their rocks, and you didn't think of the crowds in Lansing that picked up their AR-15s.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I could jump in here. And I read an article about after the demonstration in Lansing, and someone said, well, they were obviously white because no one was arrested. And they were saying if there had been any brown people there or
Yeah.
black people there, there would have been an arrest. Multiple.
Right away.
Yeah.
Right away.
I don't know how many of you have read the book Dear Church by, I think his name's Lonnie Duncan.
Yeah, I have.
Our book club just discussed it last week. And I don't know, I can't say that I really like the way that he wrote, but I think his point was very valid. And it surprised me in my book club, the people in there, the lack of understanding, I guess, of what it's like to be black, and what he referred to as the microabrasions, the things that they run across every day. You know, women grabbing their purses when they walk by, being followed in stores, being asked for ID, you know, all those things that they do, and every single one may not be directed to them as black or brown people, but the accumulation of them certainly is. And so what is it like to be that way? I've had several opportunities to be in anti-racism programs, and Dan, I don't know if you were talking about the one that they did in Kalamazoo. It might have been about that time frame that talked about institutional racism, which was really enlightening. And then we had one in the lay ministry training program, whatever it's called now, I don't know, I don't remember. And that one, we had a couple speakers that came in and talked about different scenarios and what racism looked like that way. And that again was eye-opening, much more personal. But the best class I had in my counseling program was multicultural counseling. And we had a black instructor for that. And I'd had her for a couple other classes. She was not good, but she was excellent in that one. And she explained what it was like to be black. And you could ask her questions that white people ask because we don't know. You know, what does that look like? Or what's this like for you? And I would love to be in that same situation again, where there was a Black person who would tell you the truth, doesn't take offense, is just there to educate us on what is that really like, where we don't have to be afraid of offending the person, the Black person with us, or even show our ignorance. I mean, I said something to someone one time about you people, and I meant you people in the warehouse, and he heard it as you Black people. And when it came back to me that he was offended by that, I couldn't believe it. And then I realized my ignorance in just that I really would look forward to an opportunity to have somebody talking frankly with us about what does that look like for them, what's their experience, and how do we stop doing these things. So sorry, that's kind of a long rant, but there it is.
One of the persons, it takes a person who is of color to be able to really dialogue that way. Are any of you familiar with Al Starr, who with the ELCA?
Yeah.
I have not heard him speak, but my understanding is that maybe CJ, you can nod your head to that or say to that he has a way about him that helps with that. There was a pastor in Southeast Michigan, Ronnie Abdul Massa, who was a Palestinian, and he was able to have conversations where it wasn't he didn't take offense at it, but it takes a certain person. So go ahead.
I'm fortunate to have a person like that. Well, actually, a few persons now, just in the last few years. But yeah, and it is a gift. It was a few years ago. I didn't know what DWB meant, and I was talking with my friend, and she said something like that. I said, "Well, what is that?" But we had a relationship, so it was okay to talk about things. She says, "Yeah, she's African American. I go to the hair salon, and the first thing we talk about is, well, who got shot today?" And I was like, I go to that's not what I talk about. And so, and even I have found here in Lansing, the Y that I used to go to is the most racially integrated place I have been. And I've met a number of African-American people that I've really I've kind of sought them out too. And one man, he's older than I am, he went to the Tuskegee Institute, and he said he's been pulled over 22 times in his life.
Wow. We have no concept of that. We just don't. We just don't.
And the conversations that parents have to have with their children, that white parents do not have to have with their children.
Right. That's so true.
CJ, looks like, I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Having the talk with your teenage is totally different in white and Black communities.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely, yeah. CJ, it looks like you're back online.
Well, I think you can hear me. I've moved to phone audio. Does that help?
Yeah, actually, yeah.
All right, great. Well, yeah, sorry. This conversation has been awesome. And that history piece that you shared, Rosanna, is so powerful. We do a wall of history at Bridge Builders with the high school students. And we do, as Bev mentioned, spend the equal amount of time on the resistance piece, which they find very life-giving. So I encourage people to check that out. But Ryan, back to your question, just real briefly, like a snarky response is, if you need to keep it on Jesus, just talk about the name of the first slave ship. The name of the first slave ship was, in fact, Jesus. And so, that's that. But what I was saying earlier is it's about transformational work. Like we believe in Christ, and our lives look differently as a result of that belief. Not because we have to, but because that's how we live in response. And so then how do we transform ourselves to live in response to these realities? And a meeting that I was on Saturday, I was starting to share earlier about moving from allies to being accomplices. And so, we are complicit in this history. And in some ways, as white people, we are accomplices to this history. But how do we then become accomplices in the work of joining this fight or the resistance, or standing in solidarity? And one of the questions asked on Saturday was, what does standing in solidarity look like now in a pandemic world where we will phase back in, but not everybody equally at the same time?
Yeah.
So will we stand in solidarity with people who cannot phase in because of their life circumstances? These are heavy challenges that have very hard answers. There's not. But how do we then stand with? And then, we were talking, I think, a minute ago about, we're talking about the people we know, and how do we unlearn the things instead of saying "you people" on accident and having that misinterpreted, or what are the phrases? And you learn that the way you learn to be sensitive about anything. You get in relationship with people that aren't like you, and that means stepping outside your comfort zone and your bubble. I mean, we can name, the friends we have that might be close, that we might know that are people of color, but do we really engage those communities as passionately as we do other communities, And so doing that, you'll sort of, by being in the presence of and caring for and living with people, you sort of learn what not to say. It just sort of happens. It's a matter of vernacular, I think.
Yeah. When ULC, we did a workshop with Melanie, who Rosanne talked about. 19 of us were involved for, it was like 30 hours. And one of the things that was stated at the time, I don't know why, but my brain just did not process it. But it's helped me in racial conversations and non-racial conversations. And that is impact versus intent. You might intend to sound like that "you people." Your intention was a good thing, but the impact of it wasn't a good thing. And that has helped me in a number of conversations to remember that. It sort of stopped me from talking sometimes.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, a truth, if you were to visit another country and try and learn enough of the language to communicate, I think generally people in that country are appreciative that you tried to learn that language and find it a little bit endearing, even when you make some mistakes. I think if you try to enter spaces and be able to speak to these issues because you have a heart for it, that also can show through on its own. And there is a respect given for being willing to take the risk of entering a space, not fully knowing the language, but knowing you want to speak it.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Good.
And in response to Dan, the ELCA mothership, so to speak, is working on training programs called Transforming White Privilege. And they're in a phase now of train the trainer. So there's been a desire to have both a person of color and a white person present the training and to do it regionally, so that we could train new trainers and drive down into the church to help transform white privilege.
Yes. Well, my friends, we are at the hour-and-a-half point. It's 2:30, and it's great conversation. I know several have had to leave because they have other commitments. And I would invite us to do some praying and thinking and, come back with thoughts. And we'll continue next week. And how we're going to move forward. Doug, I'm going to call it, would you be willing to share a closing prayer or a prayer to send us forth?
To give us all the answers.
Thank you for letting me pull this on you.
Okay. No problem. No problem. El Señor sea contigo, and also with you. Just in case you wondered what it's like to be in a group where you don't quite speak the language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The Lord be with you.
And
also with you.
Gracious God, you confront us with law and you overwhelm us with grace. We pray that in this time we would learn from one another, we would discover what is deep within us, and we would find a much more deeper relationship with your Son, Jesus the Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all in
Thank you, Roseanne.
next week, okay?
Hey.
Have a great week.
Hey,
Bye.
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 Bye. Thanks for this.
Yep,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep.